Many people assume spiritual knowledge begins in the mind. They believe that if they study enough, read the right books, and learn the right concepts, a higher perception will follow. Spiritual science takes a different position. Perception does not start with thought. It starts with capacity. In the Rosicrucian view, the human being is not limited to physical sense organs. The physical heart is described as the densest expression of a subtler center. When that center is awakened, it functions as an organ of spiritual perception. It is not awakened by emotion, belief, or intellectual effort. It awakens through a purified inner life. This is often missed because modern consciousness tends to distrust feeling. Thought is treated as reliable. Feeling is treated as subjective. Spiritual science reverses that emphasis. It treats refined feeling as a necessary bridge between abstract thought and living perception. In this context, the heart is not sentiment. It is a field of resonance. It registers truth through a chord rather than argument. When feeling is coarse, reactive, or self-centered, this field does not function clearly. Intellectual understanding can still increase, but higher perception does not develop. The limitation is not that higher worlds are hidden. The limitation is that the instrument of perception is not yet formed. This leads to a basic Rosicrucian claim: knowledge alone is not sufficient. Knowledge may be accurate, but it remains incomplete without inner transformation. Spiritual science presents itself as observational work applied to non-physical planes. Physical science depends on trained instruments. In the same way, spiritual science depends on a refined inner apparatus. In this teaching, that apparatus begins forming in the heart. Formation does not come from stimulation, it comes from purification. Purification is a gradual refinement of feeling and thought so they do not distort what they meet. An unpurified heart reacts quickly. It pulls experience toward desire, fear, resentment, and attachment. Those movements color perception before it can become clear knowledge. Purification does not suppress feeling. It educates feeling. In Rosicrucian teaching, feeling is not meant to be eliminated or bypassed. It is meant to be transformed. It moves from personal reactivity toward a more universal responsiveness. Only then can it receive higher impressions without distortion. This is one reason the rose is used as a symbol. A rose does not open all at once. It unfolds layer by layer. Its fragrance appears as its structure refines. The teaching describes the spiritual heart in a similar way. It unfolds through sustained inner discipline, not through intensity or sudden experiences. This process cannot be forced. Impatience tends to tighten the inner life. A strong desire for experience pulls attention toward results instead of capacity. The heart becomes tense and expectant, and that state reduces receptivity. Spiritual science begins more quietly. It begins when feeling is refined enough to receive without grasping. It begins when thought is clear enough to observe without forcing conclusions. Over time, the inner life stops demanding experiences and becomes receptive to lawful development. At that point, a shift takes place. Knowledge is no longer treated mainly as accumulation. It is approached as alignment. Higher perception does not enter confusion. It emerges where order has been established inwardly. This order is ethical, but not moralistic. It is not built from external rules. It arises from recognizing cause and effect in inner states. Some inner states cloud perception. Other states clarify it. Spiritual science treats this as a practical fact. A purified heart is not good in a social sense. It is transparent. With that transparency, perception becomes less projected. Understanding is less driven by desire. The personality is less flattered by what it wants to hear. This is why Rosicrucian training treats character as foundational. Character here is not a social virtue. it is a technical requirement. A warped lens distorts light. In the same way, an unrefined inner life distorts spiritual perception. The worlds do not change. The observer changes. When this is understood, the path reorients. The focus moves from what can I know to what must I become in order to know. The emphasis shifts from answers to development. That development begins in ordinary inner life. It begins in how feeling responds, how thought forms, and how reactions are governed. Each moment contributes to the instrument being formed. Each inner response either clouds or clarifies what is emerging. Here, the heart is presented as more than a metaphor. It is treated as spiritual anatomy. Something is being built, slowly and invisibly. It cannot be hurried. It can be delayed through negligence or self-deception. This naturally leads to a further issue. If the heart is an organ of perception, and if purification is required for its awakening, then intellectual knowledge can be insufficient. At times, it can even become an obstacle. That question opens the field where spiritual science begins, not as theory, but as lawful inner development. Section 2. Why knowledge alone is insufficient. Intellectual knowledge becomes an obstacle only when it is mistaken for capacity. Spiritual science does not reject thinking. It gives thinking a specific role. Thought is meant to clarify and organize what perception reveals. When thought tries to replace perception, it exceeds its function. The result is confidence without direct sight, concepts held firmly, without correspondence to inner reality. This happens more often than it seems. Someone can understand spiritual cosmology, invisible worlds, or stages of human evolution, and still be unable to perceive even a faint reflection of what they describe. In the Rosicrucian view, this is not a personal failure, it is a misplacement. Knowledge has been acquired without preparing the instrument needed to verify it. Max Heindel was explicit on this point. Spiritual science differs from belief-based spirituality because it requires verification. But verification is not produced by logic alone. It depends on transformed consciousness. Without that transformation, thinking stays confined to sense-based reasoning, even when the concepts are subtle and well-formed. The limitation lies in the nature of ordinary thought. Most thinking is reactive. It moves in response to sensory impressions, preferences, and inherited assumptions. It divides and labels. It compares and concludes. These functions are useful in the physical world. They are inadequate for higher perception, which is direct and integrative rather than analytical. When intellectual knowledge dominates too early, it fixes the inner movement. The individual relates to spiritual truths as conclusions instead of as living processes. They defend ideas rather than refine perception. A quiet form of pride can develop not social pride, but a satisfaction that comes from having an explanation. The person feels that understanding is already complete. That satisfaction halts development. Spiritual science requires inner plasticity over time. Feeling and thought must remain workable and responsive, able to reshape themselves as deeper law becomes intelligible. Intellectual rigidity, even when built from esoteric material, hardens the inner life and delays the awakening of higher faculties. This is why Rosicrucian training emphasizes preparation over instruction. Instruction can be delivered quickly. Preparation cannot. Preparation begins with motive. Why seek knowledge for power, reassurance, identity, or superiority, or for service to truth itself? Motive shapes the inner atmosphere. It determines whether knowledge illuminates or blinds. Feeling becomes decisive here. Unpurified feeling pulls thought back into self-reference. It bends ideas toward personal meaning and advantage. Purified feeling allows thought to remain objective. It lets thinking serve observation rather than desire. Only then does thought function as a tool of spiritual science instead of a substitute for it. This resolves an apparent paradox. Those who know more are often less certain. Those who are most certain often know less. In the Rosicrucian sense, certainty does not come from concluding. It comes from correspondence between an inner state and a perceived law. That correspondence takes time. It requires patience and restraint. It also requires the ability to remain in not knowing. This is difficult for a modern mind that equates understanding with explanation. Spiritual science demands a different discipline. Hold concepts lightly while inner transformation proceeds. When this discipline is missing, knowledge accumulates without effect. A person may speak accurately and reason coherently, yet remain unchanged. The heart remains unaffected. Feeling stays reactive. The inner organ of perception does not unfold. Knowledge sits above life instead of shaping it. Rosicrucian teaching treats this as a natural stage, not a moral error. Many people pass through a period of intellectual accumulation before they recognize its limits. When that recognition arrives, it often appears as dissatisfaction. Ideas that once felt energizing begin to feel hollow. Concepts repeat. Insight stops deepening. This dissatisfaction is not loss of interest. It is an invitation to move from the head into the inner life. At this point, the path changes direction. Study remains, but it is no longer central. Attention turns toward daily inner responses, how thought reacts, how feeling colors perception, and how motives shape understanding. The laboratory of spiritual science moves inward. Here, purification begins in earnest, not by denying thought, but by reorienting it. Thought learns to observe rather than assert. Feeling learns to respond rather than react. Gradually, a new balance forms, in which intellect serves development rather than replaces it. From that balance, a subtle change appears. Thought becomes quiet enough to register impressions not generated by the senses. Feeling becomes refined enough to resonate without distortion. Knowledge remains conceptual at first, but it begins to approach experience. This marks a threshold. Beyond it, spiritual science is no longer mainly a body of ideas. It becomes a method of inner transformation governed by law. At the center of that method stands a symbol that functions as instruction. The rose, long associated with Rosicrucian teaching, is presented here as a precise image of what unfolds when feeling and thought are purified and brought into lawful relationship. To understand that image is to move closer to the actual mechanics of spiritual development. Section 3. The Rosicrucian meaning of the rose. The rose remains central in Rosicrucian teaching for a practical reason. It is used because it is precise. It is not meant to represent emotion, mystical excitement, or vague spiritual longing. It points to a lawful process of refinement. Desire is transformed into sensitivity. Feeling is disciplined into perception. Impulse is shaped into form. In spiritual science, symbols are not decoration. They function as diagrams. A rose grows from its stem. It does not appear apart from it. It opens gradually, not by force. Each petal unfolds only when what supports it is ready. This reflects the kind of inner development required for higher perception. Nothing is added from outside. What is already present is refined, ordered, and brought into balance. The secret heart is not a metaphor for emotion. It is described as a functional center where thought and feeling meet. When these forces are uncoordinated, perception cannot develop. Thought becomes abstract and dry. Feeling becomes personal and reactive. The heart remains opaque because its two currents conflict instead of cooperating. Rosicrucian training therefore emphasizes their union. Thought must become clear, precise, and impersonal. Feeling must become calm, responsive, and free of self-reference. As this balance begins to form, a new quality of awareness appears. It is not visionary, it is not emotional, it is attentive. This attentiveness is an early sign of inner awakening. It does not show itself as imagery or unusual sensation. It shows itself as sensitivity to inner states. The individual notices how quickly feeling reacts. They notice how thought intrudes. They notice how motives shape perception. This noticing is not self-judgment. It is observation. Observation initiates refinement. When a reactive impulse is seen without being indulged, it weakens. When thought refrains from asserting conclusions too quickly, it clarifies. Over time, the inner atmosphere becomes quieter. It is not empty, it is ordered. That order is essential. Higher perception does not function well in disorder. Physical instruments require calibration. Inner faculties require harmonization. A rose does not bloom in chaos. It needs structure. For this reason, purification in spiritual science is not moral suppression. Suppression forces desire downward, where it continues to distort perception without being understood. Purification redirects desire. It educates feeling so its energy is no longer consumed by personal craving and aversion. That energy becomes available as receptivity. Receptivity is not passivity. It is the capacity to register without distortion. When feeling is purified, it stops demanding experience. It allows experience to arrive on its own terms. This quality is necessary for spiritual perception because what is forced is easily falsified. The rose also shows another principle. It opens from within. External pressure does not cause its unfolding. In the same way, spiritual faculties awaken through inner consistency, not dramatic practice or emotional intensity. What unfolds does so because conditions have been met. Those conditions are straightforward, but not easy to sustain. They include sincerity of motive, patience with process, and willingness to let inner life change slowly. The modern urge to accelerate works against this. Impatience hardens feeling. Expectation clouds thought. The rose closes rather than opens. Rosicrucian teaching therefore emphasizes rhythm. Inner work respects cycles of effort and rest, attention and withdrawal. Purification happens gradually, through repetition and restraint. Sudden insight may occur, but it rests on long preparation. As thought and feeling begin to harmonize, a subtle distinction becomes noticeable. The individual senses the difference between reactions that rise from personality and responses that arise from a quieter center. At first, this difference is faint. With continued observation, it becomes clearer. The heart becomes less reactive and more discerning. This discernment is not analytical. It is experienced as rightness or dissonance. Certain thoughts feel heavy. Certain feelings feel clarifying. The person learns to treat these signals carefully, not as moods, but as indicators of inner condition. At this stage, the rose is not yet visible as a formed faculty. What is visible is the ground in which it can grow. Character stabilizes, attention deepens, inner life becomes less turbulent. These are not achievements to display. They are prerequisites. Only on this ground can thought begin to act as a creative substance rather than constant commentary. Only then can feeling serve development rather than reaction. The rose does not bloom in the head. It blooms where thought and feeling meet. Purified of personal distortion, from that center, a different mode of knowing begins to emerge. It does not belong to belief or speculation. It belongs to inner correspondence with law. This prepares the next point. Thought is not neutral. It is formative. It shapes perception, and it shapes the vehicles through which perception later occurs. When this is understood, spiritual science moves from symbolism into exact mechanics. Section 4. Thought as creative substance. Thought is often treated as something abstract, detached from substance and consequence. Spiritual science does not treat it that way. It regards thought as formative energy. It is a force that shapes inner structure long before it appears as outward action or event. In this framework, thinking is not only reflective, it is constructive. A sustained pattern of thought leaves an imprint. This is not presented as metaphor. It is described as structural. Over time, these imprints accumulate within the subtler vehicles of the human being. They influence perception, inclination, and future capacity. Thought does not stay where it begins. It organizes the field in which future experience will take place. For that reason, purified thought is not optional. Untrained thinking is restless. It reacts, repeats, judges, and anticipates. It rarely remains with an object long enough to understand it. This kind of thinking fragments inner space. It disperses attention. With time, it weakens the coherence required for higher perception. Purified thought is different. It is deliberate and restrained. It does not rush toward conclusions. It can hold a form steadily and allow meaning to disclose itself gradually. This steadiness is not stubbornness. It is the capacity to remain with an idea without overlaying it with personal expectation. In Rosicrucian spiritual science, this capacity is developmental. Thought must be trained to operate with less dependence on sensory stimulus and emotional impulse. This does not mean rejecting sensation or denying feeling. It means not being compelled by them. Only then can thought function as an instrument rather than as a reaction. When thought becomes steady, it begins to act creatively. Creative here does not mean imaginative fantasy. It means that thought structures inner reality. It organizes subtle substance in a way comparable to how physical activity organizes matter. The difference is the plane on which the organizing occurs, not the principle itself. This has practical consequences. A mind dominated by chaotic thinking cannot sustain higher perception. Regardless of emotional intensity or moral intention, the inner field lacks stability. Thought must become ordered before perception can become accurate. This ordering is not achieved by suppression. Suppressing thought pushes it below awareness, where it continues to influence perception without being seen. Spiritual science requires conscious participation. Thought is observed, refined, and directed. It is not silenced. Direction begins with motive. Why focus on a subject at all? To reinforce identity, to satisfy curiosity, to gain an advantage, or to understand law as it is. Motive shapes the quality of thinking. Impure motive bends thought back towards self-concern. Clear motive allows thought to remain objective. As motive clarifies, thinking simplifies. Unnecessary complexity falls away. Repetition decreases. The mind becomes capable of sustained attention without strain. This is not concentration forced by will. It is attention supported by interest that is not entangled with personal craving. At this point, thought begins to cooperate with feeling rather than compete with it. Feeling no longer disrupts thinking through reaction. Thinking no longer overrides feeling through abstraction. The two move together. Each corrects the excesses of the other. This cooperation stabilizes the heart as a perceptive center. Here the constructive role of thought becomes noticeable. The inner world feels structured rather than chaotic. Perception gains depth. insight appears less as sudden revelation and more as gradual clarification. Understanding feels reliable, not because it is insisted upon, but because conditions have been established. Much of this establishment is invisible. Outwardly, little may change. Inwardly, a foundation is being laid. The vehicles through which higher perception will later function are being shaped. Thought is acting as builder, not commentator. This is why spiritual science emphasizes discipline. Not discipline imposed through external rules, but discipline that follows from cause and effect. Disordered thought produces disordered perception. Ordered thought prepares clarity. This is not moralism, it is mechanics. When this is understood, inner work becomes serious in a practical way. Every thought matters, not as a reason for guilt, but as a structural contribution. Thought either strengthens coherence or increases fragmentation. Over time, the effect is cumulative. Character, perception, and destiny are shaped accordingly. This leads to an important clarification. Purification is not about becoming better. It is about becoming precise. Precision allows perception to align with reality rather than distort it. Without precision, even sincere aspiration can mislead. With precision, development proceeds quietly and lawfully. As thought is taken up consciously in its constructive role, attention naturally turns toward another force that is often misunderstood in spiritual development: feeling. Not feeling as emotion, but feeling as a medium of energy. It is the medium that carries thought into form and connects inner life to the evolutionary process. Understanding this relationship helps explain why purified feeling becomes a decisive agent of growth rather than a source of confusion. Section 5. The science of purification feeling is usually described as something personal, shaped by preference, memory, and circumstance. Spiritual science approaches it differently. It treats feeling as a force that participates directly in human evolution. In Rosicrucian terms, feeling occupies a middle position. It stands between thought and action, between conception and manifestation. Thought gives form, action gives expression, feeling provides movement. It is the impulse that carries thought into structure and, over time, into destiny. For this reason, feeling cannot be ignored or bypassed. When feeling is unrefined, it does more than color experience. It drives development without clear direction. Desire pulls perception toward what is wanted. Aversion pushes awareness away from what is resisted. In both cases, growth still occurs, but it happens through friction rather than understanding. Spiritual science aims for a different process. It does not try to eliminate feeling. It also does not try to spiritualize it too early. It seeks to educate it. Education here means refinement, a gradual transformation from reactive impulse into responsive force. That refinement changes the entire inner economy. Unpurified feeling reacts quickly. It contracts or expands before thought has clarified what is happening. In doing so, it distorts perception and pushes action to occur prematurely. Purified feeling behaves differently. It can wait. It remains sensitive without becoming impulsive. It gives thought time to complete its work before movement begins. This waiting is not suppression. It is restraint grounded in understanding. Feeling learns to trust thought when thought is clear. Thought learns to respect feeling when feeling is refined. Their cooperation produces a stable inner field, one capable of sustaining higher perception. From a Rosicrucian standpoint, this cooperation has evolutionary significance. Feeling is not treated as only personal. It is linked to subtler levels of the human constitution. Habitual emotional responses do not simply vanish when circumstances change. They consolidate into tendencies, inclinations, and capacities that shape future experience. In that sense, feeling becomes a builder of destiny. A refined response strengthens coherence. A reactive response reinforces fragmentation. The process is lawful and cumulative, and it is mostly unconscious until awareness begins to intervene. Awareness changes the role of feeling. When feeling is observed without indulgence, it loses its compulsive authority. When it is understood without judgment, it becomes more transparent. In that transparency, feeling shifts function. It moves from being a driver to being a carrier. It becomes less a force that pushes and more a force that conveys. This shift matters for spiritual science. Higher perception does not function well in turbulence. The inner worlds are described as ordered by law. A turbulent emotional field cannot register that order accurately. Purified feeling provides a calm medium through which higher impressions can pass without distortion. This is why purification is often misunderstood. It is not moral cleansing. It is calibration of an instrument. A sensitive device must be stabilized before it can register subtle phenomena. In the same way, the feeling nature must be refined before it can support spiritual perception. Refinement occurs through daily life. It is not achieved by withdrawing from experience. It is achieved through conscious engagement with experience. Each interaction becomes a chance to observe reaction without surrendering to it. Each challenge becomes material for transformation rather than conflict. Over time, the change is quiet but measurable. Feeling begins to respond rather than react. The pause between stimulus and response widens. In that pause, thought can intervene. Choice becomes possible. Repeated choice reshapes inner structure. As structure reshapes, perception changes. The individual begins to notice subtler distinctions. Motives are sensed earlier. Emotional undercurrents are recognized before they take control. This awareness is not analytical. It is immediate. It depends on refined sensitivity, not on internal argument. At this stage, feeling begins to serve evolution consciously. It no longer pushes development forward blindly. It carries thought into form with increasing precision. What is felt aligns more closely with what is understood. Inner life gains coherence. This coherence is the soil in which the rose can unfold. Without it, symbols remain theoretical. With it, spiritual anatomy begins to function. The heart becomes less reactive and more perceptive. Feeling becomes the medium through which higher knowledge can enter consciousness. This does not produce spectacle. It produces stability. From stability, something often overlooked becomes visible character, not character as morality, but character as formed inner structure. It reflects the cumulative result of refined thought and educated feeling. This is why spiritual science places so much emphasis on ordinary reactions, daily habits, and minor inner choices. They are not minor. They are the workshop in which the instruments of perception are built, slowly and lawfully. Section 6. Feeling as a force of evolution character in spiritual science is not an ethical label. It is a constructed inner organism. Every repeated reaction contributes material to that organism. Every habitual response of thought and feeling adds structure over time. These contributions stabilize. They become tendencies that operate automatically, shaping perception and action before conscious choice has time to intervene. This is why Rosicrucian teaching speaks of inner alchemy. Alchemy here is not only symbolic language, it refers to the lawful conversion of raw inner material into organized capacity. What begins as impulse is refined into sensitivity. What begins as reaction is transformed into discernment. This takes time because the change is structural. The vehicles of consciousness through which perception later functions are not created by intention alone. They are built through consistent inner activity. Thought supplies form. Feeling supplies vitality. Repetition supplies stability. When reactions remain unexamined, structure forms unconsciously. That structure is not necessarily harmful, but it is imprecise. It reflects circumstance more than understanding. Character becomes an accumulation of defenses, preferences, and inherited patterns. Perception is filtered through these layers, and higher knowledge is distorted as a result. Spiritual science intervenes at this level. It does not try to remove structure, it tries to refine it. Refinement begins when inner reactions are seen as processes rather than identities. Anger is no longer treated as who I am. Fear is no longer taken as my nature. These are recognized as forces moving through the inner field. This recognition weakens compulsion. When a reaction is seen clearly, it loses some of its momentum. The individual is less likely to obey it automatically. Space appears. In that space, a different response can be formed, one aligned with understanding rather than habit. Each time this happens, structure changes. The change is subtle. It may not feel dramatic, yet something reorganizes inwardly. The next reaction is slightly weaker. The next response is slightly clearer. Over time, these small increments accumulate. This accumulation is alchemical. The base material is not destroyed. It is transformed. Desire becomes aspiration. Fear becomes caution without paralysis. Attachment becomes commitment without possession. Each transformation stabilizes the inner organism further. That stability is necessary for spiritual perception. Higher worlds are described as lawful and ordered. They do not accommodate instability. The inner vehicles that engage them must be coherent, balanced, and resilient. Character, in this sense, is not moral superiority. It is structural readiness. Rosicrucian teaching emphasizes daily life for this reason. Extraordinary practices cannot substitute for ordinary consistency. How one reacts in small situations shapes inner structure more than occasional spiritual effort. Each moment adds material to the inner organism. This makes life itself the laboratory. Irritation, attraction, disappointment, and delay become workable material. Not through suppression, but through awareness. Awareness allows choice. Choice alters pattern. Pattern reshapes structure. As structure reshapes, new possibilities appear. The heart begins to function as a unified center rather than a battleground. Thought and feeling cooperate more naturally. Inner turbulence decreases. Attention deepens without strain. This deepening is not forced concentration. It is availability. Consciousness becomes able to remain present without constant interference from compulsive reaction. That availability marks a threshold for genuine inner perception. At this point, the secret heart is no longer only an idea. It begins to operate, not through visions or emotional surges, but through discernment. The individual senses when a thought aligns with law and when it distorts. Feeling responds with clarity instead of impulse. Inner life gains coherence. This awakening does not announce itself. It is known by its effects. Patience increases. Judgment becomes more accurate. The need for certainty diminishes. These are not virtues pursued for their own sake. They arise as consequences of structural refinement. From here, the path becomes more demanding, not because effort necessarily increases, but because illusion must be relinquished. A common temptation is to mistake early clarity for completion. Spiritual science warns against that. The unfolding continues long after initial awakening. This requires humility, not humility as self-denial, but as recognition of scale. The inner organism is extensive. Its refinement unfolds over long periods. Each layer reveals another that still requires purification. This recognition protects against self-deception. It keeps attention on process rather than attainment, on accuracy rather than experience, on law rather than identity. From that orientation, the awakening of the secret heart proceeds quietly and with less distortion. It is guided not by desire for revelation, but by respect for the lawful mechanics of spiritual development. Section 7. The inner alchemy of character, as inner structure stabilizes. A subtle temptation appears, the desire to conclude the process. The mind looks for signs of arrival. The feeling nature looks for confirmation. The personality looks for reassurance that progress is secured. Spiritual science treats this moment carefully. Illusion does not only come from ignorance, it often comes from partial clarity. When inner perception begins to awaken, even faintly, a new orientation appears. Confusion lessens, reactions soften, understanding deepens. These changes are real. They are also early. If they are treated as completion, development can stop at the beginning of its real work. Rosicrucian teaching emphasizes this as protection rather than warning. The path does not reward self-assessment. It requires continued observation. When a person starts measuring progress, attention turns toward identity. The focus shifts from law to me. Perception becomes self-referential again, and refinement slows. This is why humility is not framed as a moral demand. It is a functional necessity. Humility keeps perception open. It prevents experience from hardening into belief. It allows insight to remain provisional rather than conclusive in that condition. Understanding can continue to evolve instead of solidifying too soon. Illusion enters when experience is interpreted personally. The inner stance shifts from something is becoming visible to I see. The difference is small in language, but large in effect. Ownership replaces observation. Identity replaces function. The inner organism, still forming, is asked to carry weight it cannot yet support. Spiritual science counters this through patience. Patience here is not passive waiting. It is allowing development to proceed without interference. Forcing a plant to bloom early weakens its structure. In the same way, forcing spiritual identity weakens perception. For this reason, the Rosicrucian path discourages claims. No one is asked to declare attainment, authority, or final insight. What matters is continuity of refinement. Are reactions diminishing? Is clarity increasing? Is feeling becoming more responsive and less compulsive? These are functional indicators, not trophies. Walking without illusion requires restraint. Restraint from interpretation, restraint from comparison, restraint from projecting meaning onto inner events before their place in the larger structure is clear. This restraint protects accuracy. Accuracy is the guiding principle of spiritual science. Accuracy requires willingness to remain uncertain where certainty has not been earned. It requires tolerance of ambiguity without anxiety. It requires reliance on lawful process, rather than dependence on memorable experiences. This reliance is not belief. It is recognition of cause and effect. When refinement continues, clarity tends to increase. When interference returns, clarity fades. These relationships can be observed over time. Confidence shifts from experience to law. That shift stabilizes the path. The individual no longer seeks validation through inner phenomena. They seek coherence. They measure development not by intensity, but by integration. Life becomes the proving ground, not inner sensation. From this perspective, illusion loses its attraction. There is no need to embellish perception or dramatize insight. What unfolds does so quietly. Its value lies in function, not display. The rose opens without announcement. This attitude protects the unfolding heart. It allows further refinement without distortion. It helps emerging faculties integrate gradually into character and conduct instead of becoming isolated as special experiences. As integration deepens, another point becomes clear. The secret heart does not awaken for personal illumination alone. It awakens in relation to a larger order. Perception aligns less with preference and more with responsibility. Knowledge becomes stewardship rather than possession. This marks a turning point. The path stops being about advancement and becomes about participation. The question shifts from what one will gain to how clearly one can receive and convey what law reveals. From here, purification and perception are no longer separate tasks. They become a single movement. It unfolds steadily, without urgency, guided by accuracy rather than ambition. This prepares the next integration, understanding the rose not as a private achievement, but as a lawful event within a larger evolutionary process, one that continues beyond the individual and gives spiritual science its full scope. Section 8. Awakening the Secret Heart. When the path is no longer understood as personal advancement, inner practice changes in tone. What once felt like effort becomes orientation. Attention stops asking what to do. It starts asking how to remain correctly positioned in relation to law. This distinction matters. Spiritual science does not develop through techniques applied occasionally. It develops through an inward stance that permeates ordinary life. When practice is reduced to method, it becomes mechanical. When it is lived as attitude, it becomes formative. Attitude here means relationship. It is the relationship between thought, feeling, and reaction. It includes how thought is held, how feeling is allowed, and how reaction is met without indulgence or repression. This relationship cannot be fully formalized without losing something essential. It has to stay responsive. The individual does not impose stillness. They notice disturbance. They do not force purity. They recognize distortion. Correction happens through recognition rather than pressure. This is why checklists tend to fail. They externalize what must remain internal. They turn awareness into compliance. Spiritual science requires something different, continuous sensitivity without self-surveillance. Inner life must be observed, but it must not be policed. Policing creates tension. Tension recreates distortion. Integration relies on restraint. Restraint from over-interpreting experience. Restraint from naming every inner movement. Restraint from turning insight into identity. This restraint preserves openness. When openness is preserved, refinement continues even when attention is not explicitly on inner work. Daily life becomes the medium. Conversation, work, conflict, fatigue, disappointment. Each reveals the current state of inner organization without requiring deliberate introspection. This is how practice becomes less visible. It is not absent. It is unself-conscious. The individual notices when thought hardens, when feeling contracts, and when reaction accelerates. They do not intervene aggressively. They allow space. In that space, alignment often returns on its own. Receiving happens here, not as a special event, but as continuity. Insight arrives without anticipation. Understanding deepens without strain. The inner life reorganizes because interference has diminished. That reorganization follows law. It is governed by the same principles as earlier stages, but it operates with less resistance. Thought can remain precise without becoming rigid. Feeling can remain sensitive without becoming personal. Character continues to refine itself without constant management at this level. The rose does not need attention. Attention returns to living. This is a paradox of mature practice. The less it is emphasized, the more effective it becomes. When inner life is trusted to unfold under law, it often unfolds more reliably than when it is constantly supervised. This trust is not passivity. The individual remains alert. Distortion is recognized quickly. Correction is subtle. There is no drama and no sense of working on oneself. There is simply responsiveness to what is present. From that responsiveness, integration completes itself. Thought, feeling, and action begin to align with less conscious effort. Inner life and outer life stop feeling divided. What is understood inwardly expresses itself outwardly without needing translation. That expression is modest. It does not seek recognition or announce insight. It appears as clarity in decision, steadiness under pressure, and accuracy in judgment. These are not cultivated as performances. They emerge as byproducts of alignment. At this stage, spiritual science is no longer primarily something one studies. It becomes something one lives. The rose continues to unfold, but it is no longer watched. Its fragrance becomes part of the atmosphere rather than an object of focus. Development proceeds quietly, sustained by law rather than by personal intention. From here, what remains is synthesis, not a summary, but coherence. The elements that once required deliberate effort begin to function together naturally. The path does not end, it stabilizes. In that stabilization, the purpose of spiritual science becomes clearer. It is not to elevate the individual, it is to prepare consciousness to participate accurately in a larger lawful order, one that extends far beyond personal experience. Section 9. Walking the path without illusion. When coherence replaces effort, what once seemed separate begins to show its unity. Thought, feeling, and character are no longer experienced as domains that must be managed. They function together as expressions of a single inner order. This unity is not forced. It emerges when interference diminishes. The inner organism no longer strains to coordinate itself. Each faculty performs its role without competing for dominance. Thought clarifies, feeling responds, action follows in proportion. That proportionality is the sign of synthesis. Nothing becomes excessive. Nothing is pushed down. Inner life reflects law more than preference. Balance is not something the individual has to construct. It results from correct alignment. At this point, earlier distinctions lose their urgency. Purification is no longer approached as a task. Discipline is no longer treated as a strategy. Awareness is no longer experienced as effort. These become conditions rather than actions. This does not mean development stops. It means development becomes self-regulating. In a healthy organism, equilibrium is maintained without conscious direction. In the same way, a refined inner life adjusts through sensitivity rather than control. Spiritual science describes this as maturation. Maturation does not add new faculties abruptly. It stabilizes what has already been forming. Perception deepens because it is less interrupted by inner conflict. Understanding expands because it is less filtered through personal motive. This expansion is quiet. It does not announce itself as insight. It shows itself as accuracy. The individual senses when something aligns with law and when it does not. Without needing to justify the perception in argument, judgment becomes more discerning without becoming critical. In this state, knowledge changes its function. It is no longer accumulated, it is recognized. Ideas are not adopted because they are appealing. They are accepted because they correspond to inner structure. What is false does not need to be debated. It fails to integrate. This correspondence is not emotional. It is structural. What fits remains. What does not fit dissolves. The individual does not defend understanding. They live within it. Here, the rose no longer represents aspiration. It represents integration. The petals are not stages to be chased. They are aspects already coordinated. The center does not seek expression. Expression radiates from it. The heart can function as a stable organ of perception because it is no longer distorted by inner division. This integration changes one's relationship with the world. Events are less likely to be interpreted personally. Success and difficulty are seen as conditions rather than judgments. Engagement remains full, but identification becomes lighter. The person participates without being consumed. This lightness is not detachment. It is freedom from unnecessary burden. Responsibility can be carried without heaviness. Commitment can exist without anxiety. Action can proceed without constant inner resistance. Such a state does not withdraw from life. It enters life more fully because it is less preoccupied with itself. Attention moves outward without losing center. Service becomes possible, not as moral obligation, but as a natural consequence of clarity. Here, the scope of spiritual science becomes clearer. It is not aimed at private enlightenment alone. It is aimed at preparing consciousness to function responsibly within a larger evolutionary order. Inner development is not the end. It is a qualification for perception, a qualification for understanding, a qualification for participation. From this perspective, synthesis is not completion. It is readiness, readiness to continue refining without fixation, readiness to receive without demand, readiness to act without compulsion. The individual stands within law rather than against it. That standing is stable. It does not require affirmation. It does not seek confirmation. It persists because it is supported by structure rather than by emotion. As synthesis stabilizes, attention naturally turns towards silence, not as absence, but as depth. What remains to be said recedes. What remains to be lived comes forward. This silence does not close the path. It opens it inwardly. It allows the next movement to occur with less disturbance. The rose continues to unfold, unseen, sustained by forces larger than the individual, yet expressed precisely through them. From here, nothing essential needs to be assembled. The foundation is already in place. Section 10. The rose begins to unfold. When nothing more needs to be assembled, attention settles into a different quality. It is not effort. It is not expectation, it is quiet participation. The path of spiritual science does not end in illumination as an event, if it can be said to conclude at all. It concludes in stability, a stability that does not depend on mood, insight, or experience. It remains because it is structural rather than emotional at this point. The rose is no longer an image to contemplate. It becomes a condition that persists. The heart, refined through disciplined thought and purified feeling, functions with less self-consciousness. It can receive without grasping. It can respond without distortion. Perception operates because the instrument has been prepared, not because effort is being applied. This is why the Rosicrucian path is often misunderstood. Those looking for experiences can overlook it. Those seeking certainty can miss it. Those pursuing identity often cannot recognize it. What unfolds here is not dramatic enough to satisfy ambition, yet too exact to be confused with comfort. It is lawful clarity, clarity that does not insist. Clarity that does not persuade. Clarity that does not need to explain itself. From this clarity, action arises when required and subsides when complete. There is less inner argument about timing. There is less urgency to prove alignment. Movement follows necessity rather than desire. This condition can feel ordinary. That ordinariness is the distinguishing mark. What once felt extraordinary has been absorbed. What once felt elevated becomes natural. Inner perception no longer competes with outer life. They coexist without friction. The division between spiritual work and living begins to dissolve. Here, silence becomes intelligible. Not silence as absence of sound, but silence as absence of interference. Thought remains available without intruding. Feeling remains sensitive without becoming personal. The inner field stays open, allowing understanding to appear when appropriate and withdraw when it is not. This withdrawal is no longer feared. Nothing essential is lost when perception recedes. It returns when conditions are present. Trust in law replaces attachment to experience. The individual stops monitoring inner states for reassurance. This is why there is no final instruction. Instruction would reintroduce effort. A conclusion would freeze a process that must remain alive. Spiritual science does not culminate in answers. It culminates in capacity. Capacity to receive truth without distortion. Capacity to act without compulsion. Capacity to remain inwardly available regardless of circumstance. The rose continues to unfold, not because it is watched, not because it is willed. It unfolds because the conditions that obstructed it have been removed. This unfolding may continue beyond conscious awareness. It does not require recognition to proceed. Participation now takes a simpler form. It consists in not interfering, in maintaining accuracy, and in remaining faithful to law rather than preference. At this stage, nothing needs to be added. The path returns to simplicity, not the simplicity of ignorance, but the simplicity that follows integration. What once required explanation begins to function on its own. The secret heart remains open, not as symbol, but as a working center within consciousness. It does not chase experience. It does not avoid the world. It stands receptive, precise, and quiet. In that quiet, spiritual science fulfills its purpose, not by elevating the individual above life, but by allowing life to be known as it is, through a human instrument refined enough to receive it without distortion.